Good evening, and welcome back to Mr. GhostWhisper. Tonight, we descend into the frozen soul of Colorado, where endless white wilderness stretches far beyond rescue, and the cold is only the first thing trying to kill you. Out here, highways vanish under drifting snow, and some travelers who disappear are never truly gone. Deep within the ancient mountain forests, something far more dangerous than wolves moves silently between the trees, watching. Waiting. These 10 winter horror stories will show you why the frozen lands of Colorado are whispered about and feared by those who survived and avoided entirely by those who know better. Each tale is a reminder that when the snow falls heavy and the world goes quiet, you are never as alone as you think. If you're new here, step carefully and subscribe to Mr. GhostWhisper for daily true horror that follows you. Long after the lights go out, turn on your notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls your name. Now, let us enter the frozen nightmare of Colorado, where isolation is absolute, survival is uncertain, and whatever watches from the storm has been waiting far longer than we have been here. Source summary: a Colorado road worker picks up a young woman standing on a snowy highway shoulder. Late at night, after returning her to a farmhouse, he learned she died years earlier. His sightings spur a small-town search and a vigil that finally allows her to move on. The story begins. I grew up 30 miles west of Leadville, where the mountains sit like old men watching the highways. I was born in a cabin that smelled of pine and oil. My mother taught school at the one-room schoolhouse. My father ran the county snowplow in winter. By 28, I was doing the same job he did, clearing State Route 24 from dusk until dawn, keeping the little towns breathing when the storms came. My name is Riley Shaw, and I keep the road open. Winter in Colorado teaches you patience. It teaches you routine. Chains on the tires, boots that never quite dry. The ritual of coffee gone cold in a thermos. It also teaches you what can vanish in a blink. People vanish in blizzards. Headlights vanish behind curtains of white. Footprints erase themselves in an hour. You learn to accept absences as part of the day. That acceptance is both armor and curse to winter's back on a Tuesday that tasted like metal. I was 2 hours into my night shift. The radio in the cab croaked wind reports, and the county dispatcher, Linda, kept the chatter low. Nervous about a school bus route an hour ahead, I had one lane open, chains biting the packed snow like teeth. The plow positioned to clean a stretch of the highway that skirts a narrow canyon. The sky was a bruise. Road markers shimmered like small lanterns. I remember humming an old country tune, my breath fogging. Then I saw her. She was standing under the faded sign for Clearbrook, a small silhouette with a dress that didn't belong in blizzard air. At first I thought it was a drift or a roadside advertisement fluttering loose. Then my headlights caught the edge of fabric and an arm lifted. A woman, maybe in her early 20s, hair loose and whipped by the wind. One hand out as if hitching a ride in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Stopping the plow isn't standard. You're a machine out on the highway. Stopping creates danger. But something tighter than logic pressed at my ribs. I eased the plow over to the shoulder, flipped on the beacons, and killed the engine. The cab hummed. She walked up without a word, not the frantic stamp here freezing gait people adopt when cold eats their joints. She moved slow, deliberate, as if she was following a memory. Her name, she told me then, was June. The voice was small and tasteless, like breath over a glass. She wore a flannel shirt under the dress and a pair of scuffed sneakers, an odd mix. Like someone had been packed hastily for stranger's weather. I wrapped a spare military blanket from the back of the cab around her shoulders. Her hands were cool, but not numbed. She did not rub them. She looked at me like she had just recognized an old song on the radio. Where you headed? I asked. The heater fought to warm the cab. Snow hissed against the windshield. Home, she answered the same way my kids said it in bed. A hollow prayer. She gave me a street and a place name. A farmhouse up the valley along East Fork Road. I had plowed that lane a dozen times. It would take maybe 20 minutes if the drift didn't bite. I asked the usual thing, phone, family, but she only shook her head and stared through the windshield. Her eyes were the worst part. They had this flatness, like old glass that reflected but didn't receive. We drove. My headlights cut a tunnel through the snow. My mind kept measuring, school bus route, gas in the tank, tires holding. My hand found the radio dial more than once, like grasping for proof of the world. We turned on a East Fork Road. Pine trees leaned inward, carrying the wind in their branches so it sounded like waves. We passed the old Miller place, a squat house with a corrugated roof, and came to the farmhouse she named. The porch light was on, a single halo in the snow. The house sat with the stillness of a photograph. June sat there and stepped out. The blanket slipped off her arm and fell to the icy ground. She walked up the path without leaving tracks. I sat there, frozen with 100 questions. The plow's heater had finally quieted, my pulse loud, and the flashlight felt like something to steady the moment. I stepped out and picked up the blanket. It was dry, absurdly dry. Salt of the roads clung to the hem, but there was no dampness from a human body. My breath fogged in the air, and for once it felt like everything around me had been edited, one frame missing from a reel. I knocked. The door opened after a moment. An older man stood framed in the doorway in a cardigan and boot tracks, leading away to the left of the porch. His face looked like a map you'd read for years, lines of sun and worry. He took one look at me and the blanket in my hands and said, "You found her." "Found who?" I asked, though I was already cold with recognition. He swallowed and held up a photograph from the mantel. A younger version of the farmhouse with a woman on the steps in that same summer dress, hair loose and a smile that didn't know the night that would come. June Hargrove. She walked out of the diner in 2009, never got to town. We searched. We prayed. They found her body by the highway 12 hours later. "You were out there then?" His voice was a flat line. "I was out there. Years ago, I had been a volunteer with the sheriff's winter search crew, green and hungry to be useful. I had looked for tracks in wind that ate them faster than you could find them. I hadn't found her." I remembered the replay of phrases, the way a supervisor had leaned and said we did all we could. A memory like a splinter. "I'm sorry," I said. It felt like a thing you say now because the word sorry can fix the past in small ways. He nodded, the way someone nods to a weather report. She came down the road and walked right up. The man, Amos Hargrove, June's father, invited me in. He poured coffee, hands trembling, and told stories about June, how she loved the river, how she danced barefoot at the county fair. He kept opening drawers and pulling out tokens, ticket stubs, a button, a locket with a photograph he'd cut to fit. Each thing was a bruise reopened. He told me the timeline, every piece learned from files and local gossip, the fight at the diner, a hissed argument with a boyfriend, the walk into a winter night that ended wrong. After that night, I couldn't shake what I had seen. I drove past East Fork more than plows required. I checked the stretch of highway where she'd been found. People in town began noticing. Linda at dispatch called me to ask if I was okay. My own hands gained a new restlessness. Nights off became walks to the garage to check the chains. I slept poorly, dreams full of white and a woman standing in the dark like a bookmark held in place. Two threads began to tug at me. First, the county file on June had aged into neglect. A report slipped into a drawer. Testimony half transcribed. A skid mark on a service road overlooked. I spent evenings at the sheriff's station asking questions. Tired eyes listened and promised to look again. Second, my son Tyler, 14 and stubborn, grew worried. He wanted a father who came home and ate dinner, not one who carried lanterns and old apologies around like extra layers. We organized a small search under a full moon with the volunteer crew. We combed ravines and culverts, called names into the wind until our throats were hoarse. Tyler found a slight indentation near a culvert, enough to make the hairs on my neck stand up. Beneath the loose slab, we found a small tin with a folded note dated 2009 addressed to home. It was a trivial thing and also everything. A piece of a night that finally had a name. On another night, June appeared again. By the old quarry, same distant gaze. Tyler insisted on coming with me. He is a practical kid. Seeing her shook him the way cold shakes a loose tooth. When she climbed in, he told a joke about needing a coat. She smiled at him like one might at a child holding a sparrow. That small human moment settled something in me. June remembered fragments, but we could help stitch them into a path dot as days bled into weeks. We brought June to places she named, sat on porches and waited with her, and watched as a house would flicker its light like recognition. The Hargroves began to leave an extra chair at supper. Amos read the tin note until the edges frayed and told us things about his daughter's laugh. The town, practical and stubborn, began to lean in. The twist came on a night in late February when the sky cleared into a crystalline hush. We had followed June to a bridge I've crossed 10,000 times. The creek under it moved slow and heavy. She stopped and said, "I was on this bridge. I couldn't get across." Her voice had an edge like a stone struck. "June," I said, "you didn't have to be alone." Tyler stood beside me, fists buried in his pockets. Breath-making brief clouds dot. She looked at both of us and said, "I don't want to go yet, but I need to stop forgetting." I realized then that June wasn't stuck in a single replay. She was rebuilding a memory, asking the living to help her remember how to finish the night alive. We made a plan. The sheriff would reopen the file. The town would hold a vigil at the bridge. The vigil was small and sincere, lanterns, the pastor's soft words. Amos with his hands in his pockets, unable to look away. June stood among us, hair loose, wind tugging at her dress. When the lanterns were lit, something eased, not a spectacle, but a drawer sliding closed. June looked at Amos, then at me, and for the first time, her eyes received light. "Thank you," she said, and walked toward the creek. I braced for some monstrous thing and instead watched as she moved into the water, like a woman stepping into a bath. Water rose around her knees, waist, and in the lantern light, her dress lost its weave. The figure took on a translucence, the edges softening until there was only the suggestion of a person, and then, without sound or clamor, she was gone. The town exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for years. Amos wept openly. Tyler laughed, a small, incredulous sound. We stood in the cold, listening to the creak and the distant clink of lanterns. Nobody else could fully explain it. We only knew the weight that had hung over the valley had lifted a fraction. Months later, the sheriff did reopen the file. A tire skid on a forgotten service road. A witness statement that made more sense with fresh eyes. Things shifted, and while not every question had an answer, the Hargroves were able to place flowers and a small plaque by the bridge. Tyler and I helped them set it, hands numb and steady. We didn't talk much. Some things don't need words beyond the work. I don't say I couldn't have done more. Regret fits into a winter like a storm front, wide and patient. But I do say this. Sometimes the night gives you a second chance, not to change what was, but to stitch memory back into the places it belongs. The road is more than asphalt. It's a seam of the lives that travel it. And when a seam frays, the town can mend it. We kept the lanterns tradition every winter, a small, stubborn thing that puts light into pockets where cold wants to live. Tyler's voice grew steadier with time. My work remained the same, and my hands learned new ways to be gentle. And on certain nights, when the highway hums and the wind cuts clear, I see a figure on the shoulder in a dress no longer threadbare with sorrow. She waves, just once, like someone who has finally found a porch light to come home to. I keep a photo in the glove compartment. On loneliest runs, I whisper June's name to the night. Softly dot the end. Source summary. A young woman moves into an affordable old apartment and begins hearing scratching and muffled voices from the building's basement. She discovers a cache of cassette recordings naming past victims and one labeled with her own name and a future date. The landlord is arrested after police find a hidden soundproof room, but a tape of the woman's own screams, seemingly recorded before anything happened, continues to haunt her afterward. I signed the lease in mid-December because the apartment's rent was the kind of small city miracle you don't ask too many questions about. Century-old brownstone, bay windows, a wood-burning stove, and a landlord who winked like he'd do you a favor. My name's Eli Mercer, 32, sound archivist by trade, restless by habit, and after a breakup that shredded my sense of home, I moved from a cramped Denver flat up into the foothills outside Fort Collins, thinking altitude and quiet might do me some good. Backstory first, because if you know where someone is coming from, you understand why they ignore red flags. I grew up in a house that hung with tape hiss and tape machines. My father ran a community archive and taught me how to splice film and label reels with ink. That smudged when he cried. I'd been the kind of kid who learned to listen to silence the way other kids learned to whistle. At 30, I had a job cataloging oral histories for the university, a collection that smelled of mothballs and coffee, and an ex who left me with half a mattress and a pile of questions. The building, 3 stories, pressed brick, the kind of place that settles into the earth, was on a narrow street where plows argued with drifts and snow sat in the gutters until spring. My unit was the back one on the 2nd floor with a little view of a stand of spruce trees. The other residents were polite to the point of reticence. Mrs. Ortega on the 1st floor, a retired school teacher who whereupon while watching the Weather Channel. Jace, a grad student who kept strange hours, and the super, Mr. Vale, who fixed things and smelled faintly of solder and lemon oil. The first week, the apartment was a dream. Morning light came through the bay glass, the stove warmed the floors, and I spent evenings cataloging field recordings, the hiss of wind over the plains, kids playing in the park. Then, on the 8th night, I heard it, a soft scratching, like a fingernail tracing the underside of a floorboard, coming from somewhere below the building. I chalked it up to mice, pipes, the old bones of the place settling. I told myself the things people say when they don't want to be afraid. The next night it was louder, more deliberate. Then a voice threaded through the scratching, low, ragged, as though someone were talking with cotton in their mouth. I knocked on Mrs. Ortega's door on my way out in the morning, because that's what you do. You check with neighbors, you trade warnings over coffee grounds. She pressed her palm to her chest like the sound had taken something from her. "Stay away from the cellar," she said in Spanish, then in halting English, "There's been things old men used to keep radios down there." "Not right. You sure?" I asked. My work had trained me to be curious to the point of stubbornness. She pursed her lips. "You don't want to poke at what sleeps, hi Joe." I laughed it off that day at work. Then the sound came at dawn. Next to the radiator, a staccato like a heartbeat, and under it, a whisper that could have been a name. That night I found myself walking down to the basement with a flashlight, keys jingling, the world outside awash of street lamp and paper-thin ice. The cellar was bigger than the footprint of the building. The air hit me like cold tea, stale and steeped in dust. Rows of boxes leaned like crooked teeth, and at the far end, under a single bare bolt, a long metal table held machines, reel-to-reel decks, portables, a rat's nest of microphone cables, and a dozen cassette tapes stacked like a tiny city. Each tape had a hand-lettered label. I picked one up. The name on it was someone I'd seen at the coffee shop, Claire H., July 1997. I pushed the deck's play button with a thumb that didn't trust itself. A woman's voice spilled out, splintering with static, pleading, scraping. Then a man's voice, calm and unmistakable. "You said you wouldn't tell," he said, as if reading from a script he'd written into the walls. I shut it off so fast sound seemed to retch back into the plastic. There was a newer tape, though, white sticker, fresh ink, Eli M. December 18, 2025. My stomach turned the way it does when you catch your reflection. It looks older than you feel. My name on a tape that had tomorrow's date. I took it upstairs like someone carrying a live thing, tucked it into a denim jacket, and told myself to breathe. I did the adult thing. I called the police. They sent an officer who was patient in that weary way people who work nights get. A tall guy named Ramos who squinted at the basement and then at me. "Old houses have places," he said, not unkind. "We'll log it. We'll take the equipment. You stay with a friend tonight." Yeah, they took the decks. They dusted fingerprints. They found an alcove behind old insulation, a room with reinforced walls, a single chair bolted to the floor, and rope stains that made the fluorescent lights look like they're hiding. Mr. Vale had a plausible deniability. Then he didn't. A pattern of transactions, cash, a history of rent help and favors rendered in weird ways. They arrested him, and the building felt smaller overnight, like a piece had been removed from its center. The police said something sensible after the processing. Maybe the Eli tape was a scare. Maybe someone pre-labeled it as a prank. The tape could be blank, or it could be a trick. They recommended I stay somewhere else for a while. I left my toothbrush at a friend's place and slept in a motel with the heat rattling like a cage. But the way I'm built, the way my father built me, I couldn't let it go. I spent nights obsessively cleaning the metadata off digital transfers at the university, pulling the decks out of evidence at the station with Ramos's hesitant blessing when he was sure I wouldn't muck it up. I began to spool the tapes into a sterile deck in a lab, to read waveforms the way people read lines in T, to original things happened then. 1. I found a pattern in the hiss. The scrapes and voices weren't random. They were layered, like a palimpsest of memory. When I ran spectrographs, I found a repeated frequency, a thin, human pulse at the edge of hearing that stitched the recordings together. The technical term was meaningless in the moment. What mattered was that the same pulse-threaded tapes labeled 20 years apart. It was as if the building had a tone it fed into people's last conscious hours. 2. Rosa Ortega, the retired teacher, asked me to help find her brother. He disappeared in 2001, and she had always suspected foul play. She didn't know about the tapes at first. She only knew I had a habit of listening. Together we compared names. One tape, unmarked, contained a soft voice that said his name. It was a voice not on other reels. Rosa sat on the floor of the lab and held her face like she might break it into pieces. "This is him," she whispered. I knew it. The more I listened, the less satisfied I felt with neat answers. The recording sometimes contained sounds that hadn't happened yet, a scream that matched the inflection of a neighbor's laugh, a phrase my sister would say at Christmas in 2 years. The tapes weren't simply echoes of trauma. They were like photographs from a camera that had no fixed direction, sometimes backward, sometimes forward. When I finally braved the tape with my name, I did it in the small hours, a coffee gone cold, the lab fluorescent lights buzzing. My hands trembled when I pressed play. My voice filled the room, rawer than any diary entry I'd made in the old days, and it screamed in a cadence that I recognized from nightmares more than memory. It wasn't a simple playback. It was a loop stitch from different versions of me, frightened, older. A whisper that might have been me asking for different things. There was a note with the tape and handwriting that was not mine. If you're hearing this, don't trust the way the building wants to finish you. The twist is what changed everything. I did a stupid, desperate experiment. I opened a portable recorder and spoke back into the tape as it played. A small, human voice threading new content into the loop. I left a message for myself, a practical plan. The kind that's terrible for horror stories, but great for living. Leave town. Check in with Rosa weekly. Burn any labeled tape you find. And call Ramos if you feel trapped. When I stopped the machine, the waveform on the screen looked braided, new line cutting through old ones. I had altered the recording. Whether I had altered anything else was impossible to say. But over the next days, things shifted. The voice on the Eli tape softened. The scratching diminished. Mr. Vale's case moved along, with new witnesses coming forward. People the tapes had named who suddenly remembered details. Rosa found a thin ledger with names that matched tapes, hidden in the false wall. The building began to feel like a mouth that had been taught new words. I could have declared victory then and moved away, burned the tapes, and taken a bribe of normalcy. Instead, I kept listening, because that's what my father taught me. We are bad listeners until we hear what the past is, trying to tell the present. I recorded counter messages on blank cassettes and slipped them into the stacks, practical notes, names, phone numbers, an insistence that if anyone picks up a tape with a future date, they call Rosa or Ramos. My message was small and ridiculous: leave a breadcrumb for a future self. On the last night, before the sheriff closed the evidence locker, I took the Eli tape, walked to the door of the basement, and left it on the table where the other tapes had lived for so long. I clicked the recorder on, and into that small plastic mouth I spoke clearly. If you are me, if you ever find this and the building has tasted you, go to the river at dawn. Throw the tape in. Tell Rosa you found it. Do not let the building keep you. Then I walked away. I can't say that the sound stopped forever. Sometimes in a hard-blink winter night, I hear a scratch and think of the way a house remembers. But the city moved on. The super went to trial. The building got new locks and a new superintendent who hung plants in the stairwell. Rosa learned her brother had left town after all, alive but lost, taking a job in a town in New Mexico, a story that ended with a plane ticket and not a casket. I kept a copy of the waveform on a drive in the habit of calling friends when the dark felt like a thing that could swallow rooms. The last thing I recorded into a cassette pocket was a voice not of warning, but of stubborn domesticity. Details of how to make a good stew. The recipe my mother used when snow came heavy and the kids wanted soup. If the building ever listened, maybe it preferred story to silence. Some evenings I drive past that block before the plows have run, the art on the boarded windows, the spray-painted snowbanks, and sometimes in the place between headlights and dark, I swear I hear a faint, far-away voice calling a name. Not mine, not quite. It could be the wind. It could be memory. I keep my hands on the wheel and drive slow, because after hearing a thing enough you learn to honor it, to answer gently, and then to go home. The end. Source summary. To friends exploring a remote wilderness cabin, discover a trapper's journal, describing being stalked by gaunt, pale men. Later they encounter similar figures at night, flee in terror, and report the incident. But authorities find no physical evidence. The narrator suspects the legendary trapper never truly died and still haunts the backcountry. I always liked places that time forgot. As a kid, I'd spend weekends at my grandfather's junkyard, poking through rusted tractors and old license plates, imagining stories for the things people had discarded. That is finding the story in a place where everyone else sees only raw followed me into adulthood. My name is Jonah Mercer, 34, electrician by trade, and the winters here in Colorado taught me that quiet can be its own weather. when my friend Lucas suggested we take a 4-day pack trip into the Elk Range no trails. Just maps, and Gut Eye said yes before he finished his second beer. Lucas grew up hunting in these hills. He respected the mountains in the way some people respect church. I figured a week away from the city and a generator of my own anxieties would do me good. We left in late November, when the aspens had already shed their gold and the days were brittle, skinned with cold. Our first 2 days felt like the kind of adventure people put on their Instagram snow stipple. Ridge lines, a thaw creek singing under a skim of ice. The stars so brazen you felt small and lucky. On the third day, Lucas cut us off the old logging road. Following a creek bed the U.S. Forest Service had marked as seasonal. He was chasing rumor, an abandoned hunter's cabin the locals called the Crow Shack, supposedly left intact for decades. We pushed through willows and willow snap, my legs sang, the cold numbing my face. When the trees opened, there was a squaw cabin hunched against the slope, gray logs slick with lichens, a sagging porch like a tired shoulder. We grinned like boys who found treasure and stepped inside. The smell hit us first: old smoke, damp wood, and something that tasted metallic on the inside of the nose. There was an iron stove, a cot with torn burlap, a shop lamp stiff with dust. On a scarred table lay a battered journal, the leather cracked, pages browned. A name was written on the inside cover, Silas Crow. I ran my thumb over the scrawl. Silas's earlier entries were ordinary trap lines, weather, a mention of elk tracks, but then the handwriting shifted. The lines shortened, the ink darker as if the pen dug harder. He began to write of being followed, shadow figures among the pines, noises that answered him when he whistled, his hounds returning with hide torn. Silence, he wrote, grew thick like winter at noon. Eventually he wrote of men thin, pale, wrapped in tattered furs who stood at the edge of his clearing and watched. The last dated entry chilled me to the bone. It spoke of breathing under the door. It mentioned a deed the writer begged forgiveness for Lucas found gouged in the doorframe lawn. Deep marks that looked clawed, and we both swore. Dark stains splattered along the floorboards near the cot. Lucas reeled back. We get the hell out of here tonight, he said, jaw tight. I should have agreed, but curiosity is its own stubbornness. We camped a little way off, close enough to check the dawn. We tried to keep rationality between us wild animals. The mind playing tricks, but the dark that night felt thicker, as if the trees were leaning in. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to footsteps. Not soft animal pads, but the slow, stomping cadence of big boots through snow, circling our small fire. Lucas was awake too, gripping his flashlight like a talisman. Breath fog hung between us. The sound moved stop, start, stop always in step, as if someone else was pacing in sync with our heartbeats. Then came breathing, not the quick, panicked gasp of a cold animal, but deep, slow inhalations, humid with animal breath. Lucas whispered, "You sure you don't want to roll, John?" I didn't answer. Something larger stepped into the wash of our lantern. A man, taller than I would have guessed. Skin pulled tight over cheekbones like wet paper, eyes deep hollows. He wore ragged furs, and his hands were stained with something dark. "You found Crow's place," he said, voice low and rasping like a screen door in winter. The smile that followed was wrong to wide, teeth catching the lamplight like a broken cone. My mouth filled with river sour panic. "Run," Lucas hissed. We tore into the trees. Snow fought our legs. Branches grabbed at our jackets. Behind us, more footsteps. Voices stitched with syllables that sounded almost like language. "Come back. It's not finished." I didn't look back until we reached the logging road. When we hit the truck, we drove until the road blurred into a smear of lights, and the heater hummed like a living thing. That morning, we went to the ranger station. Ranger Ellis listened, his face closed like he'd been told the story before. He was middle-aged, curl of gray at his temple, a man who'd grown with the mountains in his bones. "You and your buddy see something?" he asked carefully. I told the story plain. The journal, the gouges, the men in furs. He pinched his lips. "We get people finding old cabins all the time," he said. "Weather and animals, sometimes raccoons. Journals fall apart. Folks imagine. You two should go home." The kindness in his eyes was the kind that patches over fear with paperwork. A week later, an officer called. He checked the coordinates, done a daylight sweep. The cabin was decrepit, but empty, no gouges, no fresh stains. Nothing save the stacked kernels of long-dead mice. He suggested sleep deprivation, a vivid night, or just adrenaline. Lucas and I left it alone because we had to, but I couldn't. There's a part of a person that hunts answers the same way hunger hunts rabbits. I drove into town and spent a day in the Historical Society, going through microfilm and brittle newspapers. Silas Crow had been real trapper lines, smallpox in the ledger, a mention in a sheriff's blotter about a scuffle with 3 lawmen in 1934. They called him a loner, a man who kept to himself. Nothing about the men, nothing that matched the journal's ending. Only a clipped sentence. Silas Crow absent. Search initiated. At home my phone took a different tone. My sister Kira called in a panic how her mother had fallen and broken a hip. I flew down to Denver. Hospital lights and antiseptic replacing the wild with a different kind of fear. For a week and a half the Crow cabin receded into the background, a line on my map. Then Kira found an old cassette tape in a box of our father's things. Our dad had been a ham radio operator when I was a kid. They were tapes he used to record the long static nights. Kira sent me a clip. The voice on that cassette was weathered, like dried leather. It said, in the same rasp I'd heard at the fire, "You don't finish it for me." People laugh at how coincidence builds, but I didn't see humor in that voice. I started asking around local hunters, older folks in the diner, anyone who knew the backcountry lore. An old man named Hank sat me down, his hands shaking like leaves. Silas found something in the pines, he said, fingers drumming a rhythm on his coffee cup. Something that followed. Men who looked like they'd been dug up. Folks saw them when the moon got thin. We buried the stories under our tongues. That next week I went back alone. Kira said I was stubborn. Lucas said I was an idiot. But something in my chest kept a low, steady ache. I wanted to prove my eyes weren't betraying me. The cabin was exactly where we left it. If anything closer to the slope, the sky a hard white. Inside, the journal still lay on the table, pages fanned by a draft. I felt foolish and terrified as I read again. The last line's less pleading now, more resigned, spoke of a bargain, of an exchange done on a night when the moon had been a thin scythe. Silas had written, and I'm paraphrasing now, that the men asked for company and he obliged. He had cut marks in his door to keep time, because time turned differently when you let them inside. I took a picture of the entry with my phone and walked to the clearing. The snow had been disturbed by an impression of many feet, not ours. My breath came ragged. I set the journal back down and did the dumb thing people do in ghost stories. I spoke aloud. "If you want what Silas offered, take me instead," I said, half joking, whole scared. "I won't drag others into it." The wind moved with a long, slow breath. Something like a shadow stepped from the tree line taller this time. Face less a face and more a draft. It said nothing. Its head tilted like someone listening for a name. For the first time since that night, I didn't run. There's an exchange I won't sugarcoat. I felt something pressed inside my ribs, as if the cold itself had hands. I found myself lowering to the snow, palms pressed to the journal. A sudden clarity that the story wanted to be told, wanted a witness. I wasn't sure if I made that choice or if something older pressed me into it. I read the last page aloud, voice thin, the syllables tasting of iron. When I finished, the men receded like fog chased by sun. The journal was lighter in my hands, as if the pages had been hollowed. I walked back to town, the snow underfoot making a crisp record. I didn't tell Lucas everything. I told Kira I had found what I needed to move on. At night I dreamed of thin faces closing around a light. Months later, the Historical Society posted a small note someone had found a leather-bound volume from the 1930s in their donations, a trapper's ledger with an addendum of neat notations. The entry no one could explain read, "If you find this, read it once and leave it unburned. Let the story have a verb." I smiled, a small, private thing that tasted like ash. I don't say I understand the mountains now. I don't pretend the people who vanish are anything I can reasonably explain. But sometimes, when I drive the road that cuts through the Elk Range and the wind plays at the edges of the windows, I glance at the dark where the firs meet the sky. I see a shape long-limbed, patient tan. I nod. Not in fear, not in surrender. In recognition. The land holds its stories in the deep places we wander in. Sometimes it follows us home, the end. I learned to read weather the way some people read faces, quick glances, small tells. A line of clouds low and fat meant a lake effect was coming. A wind that smelled like rust and would mend a front was pushing down from the high country. My name's Cole Tanner. I'm 33. I run a county plow in the San Luis Valley in winter. And I used to be an EMT until the calls at night started feeling like somebody else's life. That I couldn't fix. The plow gave me a border I could live behind. Road, machine, repeat. Clean the lanes, sleep, eat, check on the neighbor's kids' football practices in the summer. Simple, and for a while that was enough. People around here tell stories the way they tell you how to change a tire, matter of fact, with an expectation you'll do the right thing. I grown up with them. My granddad put in the county roads and taught me the names of every ridge and arroyo. Ruth Alvarez, the librarian and town archivist, kept photographs you could touch like relics. And the mountains, they kept secrets like winter keeps ice, wrapped in a patient, indifferent coal. That November it got mean quick. The storm rolled in 2 days early. A blue-gray wall that came down off the Sangres and ate the horizon. I was on shift when the call came in, vehicle off the county route, near the old Gold Creek logging spur. 2 hunters reported something odd, and the GPS ping put them a mile past where any reasonable person should be during a storm. By the time I found the turnout, the sky had shredded into sleep. There was a shallow clearing with an old shack tucked under an overhang of pines. Logs black with age, the roof bowed. No vehicle in sight. No tracks except the hunter's boot prints and one set that led to the door and stopped. We pried the door and the smell hit, stale smoke, iron, and old sweat. On the table lay a leather-bound book, the kind my granddad would have called a ledger. The first pages were mundane. Trap lines, weather notes, a record of a winter when meat was scarce. The name inside the cover read Harlan Pike, but as the pages turned, the script jammed. The handwriting shortened and sharpened, like someone writing one-handed. Harlan wrote of figures moving at the forest edge, men with the winter skin, he called them. He said they watched without moving and that his dogs returned with fur ripped out. He cut tally marks into the doorframe to count days because time thins when they come. The last entry read, "It finished with something that made my mouth go cold. They are at the latch. Forgive me." I took the ledger to Ruth that morning once the storm let up. She sat at her desk under the warm light, fingers stained from cataloging old newspapers. "This kind of writing," she said softly, flipping a page, "shows someone tracking the same thing over and over. People who are awake in the middle of the night to listen." Her voice didn't mock. It respected the kind of fear that wraps around bones. Ruth had grown up in these valleys, her family a tapestry of miners and ranchers. She knew the folklore and the facts, and when the two crossed, she never shrugged. "Did anyone else find this?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not in the archives, but Harlan Pike is real. Disappeared, 49. Local lore says he took to the high country to settle a debt. Folks around here don't like to go near that spur." The hunter's account came through later. They heard breathing and slow, measured steps that circled their camp. Then something like a smile in the dark and a whisper, a language twisted by wind. Not quite English. When they ran to claim the air tasted of iron, I tried to sleep that night and failed. My head was awash of Harlan's ledger and the image of tally marks. On rounds the next morning, the plow's grinder blew a belt and I had to hike back to town with a bag of tools and a head full of questions. At the diner, over bad coffee, Hank, an old trapper with hands like folded maps, told me about the winter men. He tapped the counter as if tapping a barcode. "They come when the snow packs tight," he said. "Not beasts, not men, between. Folks say they keep to a rhythm, a circling. Here am and you know you gotta move on." He spit tobacco into the sink and winked at me like the story had no ending to be worried about. I shouldn't have gone back alone. I did it anyway. Curiosity has the shape of stubbornness, and my sister Kira was 2 weeks from having a kid. I figured pulling answers together fast would be the right thing. I drove out on the county road, let the plow do a shallow path and parked a quarter-mile out, then hiked the spur with a radio and a headlamp. Snow had smoothed out the hunter's prints into a soft skin. The shack looked like a black tooth against white gums. Inside the ledger's last page, something new had been added, a penciled entry in a different hand. It wasn't Harlan's old loop script. It said, simply, "If you listen, they'll make you say yes." That night the wind did what winds do, and then something else came through, a slow scraping that circled the clearing. It wasn't the scratch of a branch. It sounded like boots over packed powder, but with the hollow echo of something that wasn't walking on earth. The hair on my forearms prickled. "Who's there?" I called into the dark because you call even when you know the only answer is a thing. That isn't a person. Silence like old wallpaper. Then, low and near, the whisper began, words that slid through consonants, as if each syllable had been cooled by the river. I thought of Harlan's line about men who watch. The voice said one word I could parse, keep moving, keep time, keep as if the sentence wanted me to finish. I didn't run that night. I sat on the step with a thermos and listened until dawn bent the trees to gray. I felt foolish the next day, like a kid who disobeyed a rule and lived to be lectured. In town, Ruth and I compared notes. She found a microfilm clipping and 49 a missing person report. Harlan had last been seen on a trail, and a search had turned up only torn fur and a coat button. The sheriff at the time wrote, dryly, no sign of deliberate foul play. Subplot 1, the county file. I started going through old records in the archive, a small obsession. I traced names, miners, trappers who vanished. The ledger's columns matched others, men who kept to the high places and came back with eyes that had seen a thing miles gone from home. I began leaving notes at the Historical Society, and Ruth started a binder for me. It turned into a small project, a map of disappearances, all clustered around one contour line where the snow stayed heavy long. Subplot 2, my sister. Kira's pregnancy added a heartbeat to my choices. She called every night, anxiety raw as she checked nursery paint swatches and my own logic. Don't be stupid, Cole, she said more than once, and I heard the fear in it thick as fog. I want you around for the baby. That voice kept my feet where the plow's heater warmed my shoes, kept me from doing the reckless thing and staying out in a place where the men circling might want company. But then the dream started. In the middle of a blizzard, I would wake to the sound of slow steps and a mouthful of cold ground. Harlan's handwriting looped through the dark, and then, impossibly, I began seeing my own scrawl in the margins of the ledger when I closed my eyes. A future tense version of the phrase, leave the tally, read it out loud. One late afternoon, Ruth and I decided to do the sensible thing, collect rubbings of the doorframe, and remove the ledger to the archives for preservation. We hiked out in a gray that made the world look like old film. On the porch, the tally marks were deeper than I remembered, and the wood smelled of resin and iron. I pulled the ledger free. The pages were cold. Ruth wrapped it in a cotton sheet like she would have wound. You sure about this? She asked. No, I said, but no is a long way to stay. That night, back in town, the radio woke me at 2:13 a.m. It wasn't a tone I liked, not an alert, but a report from the hunting party who'd been out the following weekend. They'd seen a line of men standing along the ridge, pale as wine-swept bone. They said the men were looking at the town. Deputy Mallory came by with a flashlight and a face that had had too many nights like this. We'll patrol, he said. Put the ledger someplace safe. Tape up windows if you're nervous. He left like a man threading through chores. That patrol changed nothing and everything. It cost the town its sleep and my sense of safety. I began sleeping with the radio on, static swallowing the dark like a broth. The men didn't stop. They walked and whispered. Sometimes they came close enough that my porch light bled into a pale face, and you could see the way their skin stretched thin over bones. The twist came in the small hours. When I finally understood what the ledger wanted, I was alone in the archive, the town snoring under snow. I leafed through Harlan's last pages by the yellow light, and in the corner of the ledger a new line had appeared, handwriting I recognized as mine. It said, read it aloud so they remember to go. Let the tally be true. Leave this to me. I never wrote that line. No one saw me write it. I sat there frozen, the archive clock ticking like a child's heartbeat. The effect was immediate. I felt the ledger grow heavy, like a living weight, like one person's breath in my palm. There are a dozen ways I could have ended this. Burn the book, bury it, hand it to someone with a badge. Instead, I did something worse and kinder at once. I read the last entry aloud, slow. My voice filled the room, and the words tasted like the iron I'd smelled in the shack. When I finished, a calm settled so sudden I thought the ceiling had shifted. I left the ledger on the archive table wrapped up. The next morning, a snowplow driver from another county came through, a talkative guy named Eli, and he saw the ledger and asked about it. I told him something true and small, that some stories want a witness, and sometimes the witness has to stay to keep the story honest. The ending isn't clean. I'm not a hero. I found that the ledger didn't demand a human sacrifice so much as a steward. If the tally marks were a clock, they wanted someone to wind them once in a while, to read, to keep a measure between the dwindling and the leaving. So I made a choice that felt like skin. I kept a copy and left the original in the archive. But I began to visit the shack on nights when the sky was flat and the moon was a thin coin. I'd sit on the steps with a thermos and read aloud from time to time, not to summon, but to remember. The men would come like wind through trees, pause at the edge, listening as if for a cadence they had lost. Ruth said I was a fool. Kira called me selfish. Deputy Mallory sighed and patrolled when he could, but the sightings in town ebbed. Hunters still tell a story, but it's quieter now, like a neighbor lowering their radio. Whether that's because my reading anchored the thing, or because time finally wore the edges off the tail, I can't say. I do know this. Some deaths asked for a witness instead of a body. When Kira's boy was born, a little loud bundle with my mother's nose and my sister's stubborn jaw. I held him and felt the ledger's line in my chest. I did not vanish. The men did not take me. Instead, I learned to live with the sound of slow steps and a voice that liked the word keep. I learned to feed the town's nights with stories that were true and small, the kind that help you sleep, sometimes in late storms. When the plow's engine hums and the stars are soft, I park by the old spur and listen. The men stand like a line of trees at the margin, not crossing but waiting. I read a passage, mark another tally on the inner doorframe, and go home. There's a prudence to that work, not heroics but maintenance. Some stories, I think now, are monsters to be slain, but rooms to be unlocked once in a while so memories don't pile up. Like dead leaves, I've stopped telling the ledger's whole tale. A few people know the bones of it, the way the men look, the phrase Harlan repeated like a prayer. The rest get a quieter version, an old trapper and an old debt and a town that keeps watch. It's kind of that way. On certain nights the wind still says something like a warning, but now when it comes, I stand on the porch under my coat, push my palms into the cold, and call back, "All right, we remember." Then I go in and sleep, the county road humming outside like a steady pulse. The end. I tell you I went looking for a story to fill a hole in me, and you nod like you understood. That's the truth in the small way people want to believe, that we wander into old places, because something in us needs a shape. My name is Red Calder. I'm 31. I drive a dump truck in the western San Juans when the thaw lets me, and I collect other people's stories in the off-season. Not the big, pretty ones that win prizes, but the weather-beaten kind you scrape off porches and polish with care. My sister runs the bakery in town. My dad taught me to respect a rope and a rule, and my mother used to warn, "Don't poke at what sleeps." I nearly forgot that line until the cabin. We were three, me, my buddy Jonah, not the electrician Jonah, different Jonah, gruff, with a laugh like a gravel road, and Piper, a freelance photographer who loved rust and ruin. It was late January when Jonah found the coordinates in an old miner's ledger. He'd bought at a flea market in Are, Crow's Hollow. The note read in somebody's cramped hand, "Cabin on the East Fork, untouched." That word, untouched, does something to hundreds of ghosts. We parked where the logging road turned to drifts and hiked the ridge. The wind worked like a sander that day, the pines scratching sky. Where the trees opened, the cabin sat bent to the slope like a tired thing. Logs silvered by weather, a porch sagging like old teeth. Up close the wood smelled of smoke that had long ago gone cold. And something else that hit me like iron, the clean tang of old blood, cured and dead. Inside the place felt like a pocket folded in time. A cot, a stove scraped with ash, a shelf of canned goods that looked like museum pieces. On the table, a journal bound in cracked leather, thick, heavy with entries. The name inside, Thaddeus Marlowe. Different than the legend Jonah had expected, but names slide the way ice does. Thaddeus started like most trappers, trap lines, weather, the price of flour. Then the ink changed. The entries grew terse, the dates clotted together. He wrote of men in fur first as shapes, then as people, then as a presence that would not leave. He described their faces like something seen at a bad angle, to pale, stretched over cheekbones you could count, and a silence that rode after him. He wrote he cut marks in the doorframe to keep the nights honest. He closed with a line I'd read later and found myself tracing on a ragged page with a thumb. Until it hurt. They learn you if you teach them song. Piper was the first to say we should go. Jonah's face went tight. He wanted distance. We should leave a marker and come back with lights, he said. That was the sensible plan. Instead, we camped 100 yards down the hollow, close enough to the cabin that the smell of wood smoke felt like a memory. Night in the high country is not polite. It arrives blunt and honest. The first hours were our talk, stupid jokes, coffee, the sound of wind riffling the trees. Then, like the hinge of some giant door, the air changed. The silence thickened. A sound started, a footstep, or many footsteps, measured and deliberate, patting the hummock snow round our camp. Not a scramble, not a slither, but a cadence like someone pacing with a metronome. Jonah went white as milk. "They're circling," he whispered. The dogs, we brought a terrier because Piper couldn't stand being without a pet, curled and growled like a small engine about to stall. Something moved in the wash of light from our small campfire. At first, it was a suggestion, a tallness that had the wrong proportions, long arms that ended in 2 fine fingers. Then it stepped into the ring of fire, and we saw the face. God, the face. Thaddeus wrote of hollow eyes, and I thought he'd been a dramatist. This face was paper thin, the skin stretched taut over bone, mouth pulled into a grin that had no humor. Fur hung in tatters. Fingers were stained as if the hands were always warm with iron. You shouldn't have come, it said in a voice that scraped like an old bell. Thaddeus's name on the journal felt like a burn in my pocket. We ran. The cold punched us hard, our thighs chewed by brush. Behind us, other footsteps answered, multiplies in the trees. Voices pressed through bark in syllables that were almost language. Come back. Not finished. When we hit the road, we didn't stop until a raised lights blurred and the truck's heater became a small, necessary miracle. The sheriff listened with a polite face like a man used to odd calls. He made a report, penciled something, said he'd send a deputy to check. The deputy came the next day, walked the hollow in daylight, and reported only an abandoned cabin. No gouges, no fresh blood, no prints that sat differently than old melt tracks. Mice, or weather, he said, and offered coffee the way people do when they want to be helpful, but not alarmed. Jonah and Piper swallowed their fear in polite sips, but I didn't. The ledger tugged at me. I went back alone 3 times over the next 2 weeks, ostensibly to take better photographs for Piper, really to feel the place the way you press a thumb into a feeling. Every visit the journal had moved an inch to the left or right, or its pages were slightly more ruffled. I started to notice things the daylight had previously hidden, faint tally marks under the doorframe, a scrap of cloth caught on a nail, tiny symbols etched on the underside of the table. Once, under the stove, I found a crudely wrapped bundle, a locket and a scrap of hair as white as the snow. It wasn't blood or gore, but it was intimate in a way that made my hands shake. Subplot 1, the town binder, Ruth, the archivist at the San Juan Historical Society, and I built a small folder. She'd known the Marlowe family name, a lot of them gone or scattered. There were newspaper notices in 49 about Thaddeus missing, about dogs returned without colors. Ruth found a clipping with a line that chilled me. Searcher's report sounds like human voices. None locate source. She and I cross-referenced old land surveys. Found clusters of vanishings around the East Fork. This became our small, silent obsession. We'd trade notes over stale cookies and she'd scold me for staying out past dark. Subplot 2, Piper's footage. Piper, with her camera and her steady hands, insisted on documenting everything. She sent me rolls of film and digital files. Sometimes the footage froze on a frame of the cabin that had not been there minutes before. Once a clip showed what looked like a second, pale figure peering from the tree line, and on the frame before and after, nothing. When she ran the footage in slow play, the pixels around the figure seemed to shimmer like heat. We took this to a friend, Luis, who worked in visual effects. He swore the artifact wasn't digital corruption. Either you've got something very strange here, or you've found a new kind of glitch the internet will eat alive, he said, chuckling with the kind of disbelief that's really a prayer. One night, determined to end the knot of fear, we brought a voice recorder and read aloud from the ledger. Thaddeus's last page held an instruction or a plea. The handwriting looped and broke as if the pen had been drugged from fingertip to fingertip. It asked, once, that someone hear what had happened and tell it true. Tell it as it was, Thaddeus had scrawled. There's a right to knowing. We read. We taped our voices and left the recorder humming on the table. Afterwards, snow began to fall soft and sweet, and for the first time in days the woods felt simply silent like a held breath. We laughed then, shaky and raw, like people who hadn't admitted how tired they were. Everything changed after the sheriff's follow-up. He invited us to the station to talk. The deputy had found scratch marks inside the cabin the size of a man's hand, and a smear of something dark near the cot. When the news came to town, a knot of locals arrived at the station to see. The sheriff's expression when he told us was a fisher. We found nothing, he said flatly. It's an old cabin. Weather, animals. We're filing this as misidentification. But there was, Jonah began. We can't file on what we didn't collect, the sheriff interrupted. A year ago, that same sheriff had lost his brother to an avalanche. He was careful with facts and kinder to grief than he let on. Then the twist that gave me the next dark work, the deputy called back quietly from a payphone 2 nights later and begged me to come down to the ravine. You see this. You tell me what you think, he said. We went in with a headlamp and the flashlights. The deputy shone his light on the side of a boulder, and there, neat as a clock, were the same tally marks from the cabin's doorframe, carved into stone, freshly scraped. The deputy looked at me like a man who'd been given an impossible truth. We don't keep this, he said. Not in records. He tipped his hat, and when we drove back to town the sky leaned in. That night I dreamed of hands tallying time on bone. I decided then that stories needed guardians. Thaddeus's last line, "They learn you," had been a warning and a guidance. I built a plan that lived in small increments. Document, leave no trace I hadn't already left, and reconcile names. I returned to the cabin with Ruth and the deputy on a legal afternoon, and we removed the locket, cataloged the pages, and burned one piece we found beneath the floor. We buried the ash in a place Ruth said was for letting go. When we covered it, the wind came up and the trees leaned, and if you squinted, you could pretend the world was simply another day. The ending is not a tidy hero's ribbon. It's quieter and worse and kinder all at once. Over the months, sightings grew rarer. Piper's footage began to show fewer anomalies. Jonah stopped sleeping with the porch light on. The townsfolk who'd seen shapes at the tree line muttered less and took to leaving small relics. On the Historical Society's porch, a button, a bit of ribbon, a photograph. They were tokens for things they wanted to be remembered, not trophies. But on a thin morning in March, when the snow was a crust and light came like coin, I sat on the cabin's porch and felt the ledger warm in my lap in a way that had nothing to do with weather. The men came out into the hollow then, standing along the tree line like a row of leaning fence posts. They did not approach. They did not smile. They watched, and the watching was not hungry anymore. It was the tired patience of something that had been remembered. One of them, the one with hands like knotted root and eyes like empty cups, lifted a hand not to gesture toward me, but to lift the hem of his coat. In it, folded, was something we'd burned months before, a scrap of the locket, a thing we promised would be ash. I stood. No drama, no big speech. They weren't collected or vanquished. They were acknowledged. The hollow exhaled like it had been holding its breath. The ledger in my hands felt like a thing finished being told. I left the pages of Thaddeus's journal at the Historical Society under Ruth's care. She cataloged them with a tenderness that looked like prayer. The deputy kept the tally marks on paper in a file that he swore he'd never let a politician touch. Piper printed a single photograph of the tree line with shadows so faint you had to squint to see them. She hung it in the gallery window and said it was her favorite work. Jonah moved back east to be near his mother. I keep the locket's twin, a plain band of silver, under my floorboard. Does the cabin still hold men at the tree line? Sometimes when the wind hardens and the moon goes thin, I think I see a silhouette. I don't go running now. I stand on my porch, the ledger's lessons washing my hands of the need to fix everything. The men have their catalog of nights. The town has its watchers. I tell the story when someone sits too long in the dark and needs the knot untied. I don't tell it like a warning wrapped in a slap. I tell it like a ledger, names, dates, a truth worn by use. When my nephew was born in April, I took him out to the edge of the hollow once, pushed back his tiny sleeve so his palms could feel cold, and showed him where the tall trees made a fence. These are old places, I told him. They hold stories. We remember so they have somewhere to rest. He gurgled and kicked at the snow, unconcerned. The men remained at the tree line, patient as old fences. I waved once at the nearest shadow, and if it had blinked I didn't see it. But there was no hunger in their posture. They seemed simply to be waiting for someone to remember them without needing to be saved. Some nights at 2 a.m., when the plow's heat hums and the road is a line of white, I still hear a cadence in the pines, a slow, measured step, like a metronome someone left behind. It is not a call to fear so much as a rhythm to live around. I count my time, make marks in the margin of the wooden frame, and keep a ledger for my own. Memory, I have learned, is a kind of keeping. We look after stories, and in return they look after us at the end. Source summary: a long-haul tow operator responding to an abandoned car on a stormy highway encounters a soaked, barefoot woman who insists she was taken and a hulking, inhuman man in the trees. Both vanish without trace and the victim's missing person case remains unsolved, after which the operator quits and is haunted by it. Voicemail repeating her plea. I learned every inch of that stretch of road the way some folks learn the lines on their palms by doing the work until it wears grooves into you. My name is Mateo Cruz. I towed heavy rigs for 12 years on the $1 Million Highway, the bit of US 550 that drops and curls from silver into RA. People call it beautiful and deadly in the same breath. I called it a job that keeps you honest. Late nights, ice on the mirrors, the kind of loneliness you carry in the pockets of your coat. Backstory first, because it matters. I grew up in Durango. My dad a mechanic with hands like wrenches and a temper that got softer as he got older. I learned to drive by age 18 and to listen to engines like they talk back. The road taught me patience, and when I was young and reckless, it taught me fear in teeth and gravel. After my ex left and took half the furniture, towing was honest money and cobbled me together. I like the rhythm, a dispatch at 2 a.m., a coffee gone cold, the pulsing radio. People always think the big jobs are glamorous. Most of them are rain and paperwork. September 2011 came in wet and sharp. A low front sat over the sand dunes, blowing rain so heavy it blurred the reflectors. The call came in at 2:45 a.m. Abandoned sedan on mile marker 137, lights on, door open. The dispatcher was terse that night, too many calls, too few hands. I found the Civic quick enough. Headlights still burned like the tired moons. The car was pressed against the guardrail, hood down, no skid marks, no other vehicle. The driver's door was open a crack, and rain sheen across the interior like sweat. I always do the same walk around. Flashlight, check for fluids, check for footprints. That's how you keep your head. Then movement in the mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the asphalt, soaked through her hoodie, hair glued to her face. She was barefoot, which made no sense with the cold and the rain. "Ma'am," I called, voice louder than I wanted. "You okay?" She didn't answer at first. Then she lifted her head slowly, and Jesus, she looked like a woman who'd been left in a storm long before I saw her. Lips blue at the edges, skin a pale, eyes unfocused like someone looking past the world. "Don't leave me," she whispered. I radioed dispatch for EMS while I stepped closer. "I found a person, looks hypothermic. I'm on scene at mile 137. The voice on the other end was channel quiet. She took a step toward me and my boots sank a little into the shoulder. I caught sight of her feet, then, crusted with dried blood, pine needles stuck between toes. The rain wasn't washing it away. It clung like a stain that time had already finished with. "When did you crash?" I asked, trying to pull her back into the ordinary facts. She blinked as if the words were heavy. "I didn't crash," she said so soft I had to lean in. "He took me, something in me, the tuned, professional part, clicked into motion." "Okay, sit on the bumper. Stay there. I'm calling for help." I keyed the radio again, voice steady. The woman's head tilted toward the trees. "He's still here," she said. "He's angry." I followed her finger with my light. The tree line was a black wall. Nothing moved, just a whisper of wind through lodgepole pines. When I turned back, she was gone. Not gone like she'd walked away. Gone like someone had taken a page from the world and folded it up. I spun. Flashlight stabbing the dark. Then 10 yards off the shoulder, half in shadows, a man stepped out tall. Water dripping from shredded clothes that might once have been a jacket. The kind of stillness that isn't calm. It's something else, waiting. When my high beams lit him full, he was wrong in the small. Honest ways you notice when something's not alive the way you expect. His skin had bruises like bruises forget to be, and his posture looked like a wire sculpture of a man. When his head lifted and his eyes met mine, they were pits, black as new tar. "Hey," I said, throat thick, "get off the road." He didn't move. Then he did, stepping backward toward the tree line and folding into shadow until he vanished like smoke. I don't chase things that aren't worth dying for. I backed the rig and hooked the Civic, radioing in what I could for the report. Once I had the car on tow, I glanced in the rearview. The driver's seat was empty. Then, for a second, in the glass of the passenger window, I thought I saw her sitting there, hands at the wheel, mouth the shape of a silent scream. Then the glass fogged and the image collapsed. By morning, the RCMP met me at the lot. We walked the shoulder together. They lifted the trunk and found the woman's wallet tucked beneath a spare tire. ID said she was 22, from Prince George. Reported missing 3 days earlier. No footprints in the mud. No blood on the shoulder. No sign of anything beyond the Civic's lonely lights the night before. The Mounties were professional, and one of them, polite, soft eyes, asked me to stick around for questions. I left my badge at the recovery yard that day, but I didn't leave the road. The next 3 weeks tightened me. At home, the coffee went cold on the counter. My hands found the steering wheel more than the TV remote. I took early shifts and late shifts and tried to act normal, but the night it happened leaves a residue that won't dry. 3 weeks later, I got a voicemail on my enlisted number. I don't know how the caller got it. It was thin with static, wind lashing at the mic, then the woman's voice, "Don't leave me." After a pause, low and furious, a man's voice that didn't sound like any living man I'd heard, mine. The line cut. I played it for my sister at Christmas when she visited, and she nodded in a way that made me feel smaller. "You should quit that route, Teo," she said, using the nickname my family uses. "That road takes people." I did quit. I sold the rig at auction the following month. The boss offered me transfers, overtime, incentives, the kind of things people toss at scared men to silence them. But I couldn't. Every set of headlights looked like a lantern guiding something that shouldn't be moving. I learned the geography of fear, the places your mind laces to memories. For me, it was mile 137. People asked why I left. I told them different parts of the truth. To my mom, I said storms made me tired. To co-workers, I said the routes were too long. To myself, I said that sometimes the road tells you when enough is enough. Sometimes at night the voice returns, not through the radio, but in the grain of rain on the window. There are things you can numb yourself to: boredom, bad coffee, the ache of lonely highways. But you can't numb the sound of a voice begging. It burrows into the places that keep count. Years later, I still drive other roads, shorter runs that end before dark. Once, on a delivery up to Silverthorne, I passed mile markers and felt the old pull and urge to slow. I checked the mirrors, watched trees lean like old men. Nothing stepped out that day, but I remember the smell of rain on asphalt and the way blood settled on a calf like rust, and I keep my hands on the wheel a little tighter. I never stopped wondering what the woman meant when she said, "He took me." He who? Some kind of predator? A man? The forest? The highway itself? Maybe the answer is a mix of all of them. Some places have patterns, the way the trees swallow sound, the way headlights make white doors. That stretch of 550 kept its own sort of appetite, and for the first time I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of the road's grocery list. If you ever drive that route at night and you see an empty car with a door open, stop, call someone, sit light on the shoulder. Don't be the kind of person who leaves. I know how that sounds, heroic and foolish and a little like a sermon, but the woman's last words keep me honest. Don't leave me. I can't promise what will happen if you don't, only that the asking itself is a weight you carry. Sometimes, when the rain pounds steady and hard, I pick up my old phone and listen back to that voicemail. The static is a microphone for ghosts, or for grief, or for both. The woman's voice is the same small human thing I heard in the mirror that night. She asked for help, and the road answered with a man who was not quite alive. I don't tow on 550 anymore, but when the wind comes in from the west and the clouds hang low, my hands twitch like I might reach for a radio. I keep driving the shorter runs. I call my sister, and I make sure the headlights on my truck stay on. Every so often I whisper back into the dark, not because I expect an answer, but because it feels right to say her words out loud. I'm not leaving. The end. Source summary: a young hotel housekeeper at the Fairmont Banff Springs sees a ghostly bride who repeatedly appears burning on the grand staircase. Research reveals the bride's real identity and tragic death in the 1930s, and on the housekeeper's last night, the apparition finally appears peaceful and fades away. I was 26 when I took the night shift housekeeping job at the Ravenwood Lodge, a stone and timber resort clinging to a bend of the Elk River. People come for the slopes and the hush. The lodge comes with its own old bones, carved balustrades, a lobby piano that never quite stayed in tune, a chandelier that trembled when the wind hit the canyon right. My name is Maya Ortiz. I grew up in Pueblo with a mother who could make a tortilla seem like a benediction and a father who taught me how to balance money and risk. I took the job because winter paid overtime and because I like the silence. That comes after the last guest check-in. There's a ritual they teach you at orientation: how to salt the pots, how to turn the chandeliers slowly so the bulbs last, and with a half smile and lowered voice, if you cross the bride, don't step in front of her. It's the kind of story staff hand down like keys, equal parts caution and folklore. I laugh the way you laugh at all the small superstitions you don't intend to learn until they walk into your hallway. At 3 a.m. the first night I saw her, I was rolling a car of fresh linens down the east corridor, the wood creaking in time with my steps. The lodge was empty and the silence had a kind of weight, like an unmade bed. From the dining room, the faintest thread of music wound up, a waltz on a piano, tender and stubborn. I stopped. The sound shouldn't have been there. No events, no recorded speakers, and yet it filled the curve of the stairwell. She stood on the lowest stair like a bride who had misplaced time. The gown was vintage lace, a collar high and small roses scattered across the veil. Her presence looked like light folded into cloth. It trembled. When she lifted her hand, the lace at the hem caught like something flammable. Not a flicker, a hungry, silent burn that traced the gown upward in slow, licking waves. She didn't cry out, but her face shaped a sound that never left her mouth. I froze. The world tightened to the width of the banister. She climbed, stone under her feet. Each step left a heat-like breath on my skin. When she reached the landing, she paused and looked toward me, and the look was not of someone who wished to be seen so much as of someone pleading to finish a sentence. "Help me," she mouthed without sound. After that night, the job stopped being quiet. I read everything I could find at the town archive, old papers in a musty room where Ruth, the archivist, winked and said, "A lot of folks think the lodge makes its own ghosts." I found a wedding announcement from 1929 for a woman named Eleanor Hale. There were photographs, a young woman with a nervous smile, a coat of snow in the background, a man beside her who didn't look like happiness. A follow-up clipping told of a ceremonial mishap at the reception. The word accident appeared in small, desperate font. There were no coroner's details in the public record, just a thin paragraph and the sudden erasure of a new bride from the social columns. I began to keep a small notebook in my locker. The more I saw her, the way she repeated her last walk like a gramophone needle that stuck, the more I felt something was unfinished beyond grief. The sound of the waltz never varied. It wound and rewound like a clock trapped between hours. I started leaving small things at the stair landing, a sprig of dried lavender, a ribbon, a paper crane. The next morning, some of it had shifted, as if handled by hands that did not leave a trace. Subplot 1. The piano. The instrument itself was peculiar. It would breathe notes in the small hours, chords that had no witness. Luis, the sommelier who worked nights before his shift at the bar, told me he'd seen the keys to press in a pattern that matched the waltz I heard. He swore it wasn't drafts. The piano was tuned and heavy and anchored. Together we recorded the midnight notes for weeks and found a pattern. A single melody folded into the music like someone humming one line under their breath. The melody matched an old lullaby from a small town in Maine. That connection felt meaningless and then necessary. Why would a mountain bride carry a sea song? Subplot 2. The missing groom. At the archive, I found the groom's name, Arthur Pembroke, listed as a lumber broker who left town abruptly in 1930. With no obituary, no monument. A descendant's letter, folded into a box of estate papers, mentioned an argument. A man seen arguing by the river. Ruth suggested the family quietly paid the newspaper to bury certain lines. People clean up what they can, she said. They bury what they're ashamed of. When I took the letter to Ruth, she admitted, quietly, "Maya, some stories get covered. They don't all vanish. Some wait." The second time I met her, the burn was farther up the gown, smoke licking freckles on her cheekbone. She reached toward the banister, fingertips trembling. I stepped forward, against every superstition and the sticky throbbing in my chest, and said aloud, "Eleanor." The name felt like an address. Her mouth opened and formed Arthur, fragile as a moth. I asked around the staff quietly, and Luis remembered an old gardener who had spoken of a man who left midnight tobacco in a hollow tree, and a house that had sold abruptly. The pattern lined up like bones. An argument, a man who left in haste, a bride who burned. I thought about the photograph of her smile and the way the band looked at the groom as if he might fall. One night I stayed late to write an inventory and an automatic. Lights flicked in a way that made the lobby look like a photograph. The walls crept up behind me and Eleanor hovered on the stairs. She looked less like a ghost then and more like a patient thing that had been learning the gestures of the living. I sat and opened my little notebook, hands shaking, and read aloud the names I found. Eleanor Hale, Arthur Pembroke, June 9th, 1929. The words felt like stakes. She took one step down, and this time the flames didn't climb the lace. Instead, the gown shimmered and the veil fell back. Her face clearness edged like a coin polished. The sadness in her eyes softened. She whispered so low I almost didn't catch it. He lied. Her voice was the room after a window closes against a storm. Then, as if gravity had an opinion on pity, she lifted the hem of her gown and from underneath it slid a small scrap of paper. It fell into my palm like a confession, a note in faded ink. Forgive me. Hey. Between the lines, someone had written another name in a tremor of pencil. Not forgiven. The lodge had kept secrets, and secrets have weight. I took the scrap to Ruth. She told me that records could be amended, and newspapers could be asked to be quiet. Money buys silence. Death sometimes buys forgetting. But a ghost refuses to be brushed into a footnote. The ending came in a small, human way. I organized a quiet reading in the lobby. Nothing formal. Just staff and a few old-timers who remembered the lodge when the rails were new. We read newspaper clippings, letters, and the names out loud. People wept in slow, practical increments. Louise placed the scrap of paper into a book and lit a candle. I read Eleanor's name and her wedding date until the echo filled the chandelier's hollow. Afterward, I returned to mop the landing. The waltz came and Eleanor stepped into the light. She looked at all of us like someone who had been given the correct syllables back. She walked the stairs slowly, this time without fire. And when she reached the landing, she did not vanish. Instead, she gave the smallest, real smile, a soft purse of lips like a bell, and drifted up the staircase until she seemed to fold into the chandelier's glow. The piano held a single last note. We never saw her burn again. The story turned, not into a tidy solution, but into an altered weather. Staff stopped whispering warnings like charms and began telling a fuller story of a woman named Eleanor who died poorly, and of a man whose reputation had been smoother than his conscience. Guests noticed the music sometimes and asked about the lodge's history. We told them the truth with a kind of careful pride. The scrap of paper disappeared into the Historical Society's collection. Ruth cataloged it under unresolved. I quit that winter to take a job closer to my mother. Before I left, I walked the staircase one last time and placed a single paper crane on the landing. Something bright and ridiculous. The crane was gone when I returned to the lobby for my coat, but the chandelier looked warm, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the whole lodge sighed like a place that had been listened to. Sometimes, when I drive through the pass and the weather is thin, I hear a distant waltz on the radio, and I think of lace and smoke and a small paper folded in ink. Not every unresolved thing needs a tidy end. Sometimes it asks only to be noticed and to be given a name. The end. A year after the reading, I stopped working nights. I took a day job closer to my mother, whose hands had started to forget how to make tortillas without a list. Before I left, I pressed a folded note in the crook of the piano bench. It said, simply, Agnes Lockwood, kept the night. Thank you for the small, stubborn work, for the lullaby sometimes, late when the wind is thin and the river is an exact silver. I walk past the lobby and hear a single, careful chord. It isn't a summons. It is an exhale. The hotel holds its histories like a cabinet of plates. We dust the edges so the stories don't gather the sort of mold secrets growing. Remembering is how we let some things stop walking in circles. The end. I learned to carry silence in my coat pocket the same way some people carry peppermints. A small thing you take out when the world gets too loud. My name is Nora Vega. I was 27 and had taken the night housekeeping shift at the Old Hollow, a Riverstone hotel that had been patched and repatched until the modern guests thought it timeless, and the old hands called it a museum. I like night work, the hush after checkout, the slow, patient work of folding towels, the lull of the boiler. It kept my head clear. They give you a rundown and orientation that feels like folklore. How to replace a bulb without waking a guest, where the mice like to hide, and in a half joke, a half warning, if you find her in the staff room, step aside. Everyone said it like it was an inherited recipe, the sort that tastes different depending how much grief you fold into it. I laughed too. I didn't expect the laughter to be a thing I'd ever have to explain. The first time I heard the lullaby, I was mopping the pantry. The tub room door squealed in the draft, and the oil in the rusted stove burbled like tea. The lullaby came up the stairwell, a single, crooked tune on a piano, windswept and small. It wasn't the hotel playlist. The notes were off time, like someone playing from memory in the dark. I followed it. She was in the staff locker room, leaning with both palms on the wooden bench. Her uniform was old-fashioned, a plain cotton dress with a white collar, cuffed sleeves, and a small white cap I'd only seen in photographs. Her hair was a tight knot at the nape of her neck. She wasn't a hologram or a trick of the light. She was like the idea of someone, fleshed into the air. The color drained from the room the way summer fades to winter. Her hands hovered above the bench as if she'd been mid-task. When she noticed me, she didn't startle. She never blinked like the living do. Her eyes, if I can call them that, were a soft, misty gray without focus. The lullaby stopped. She turned her head like she smelled the rest of the night. "Can I help you?" I said, the word small. She looked at me and something like recognition trembled. Like a trained sign, her mouth shaped a single sound I heard more than felt. Did they sleep? I didn't have a rule for this. I told myself to be professional. "Who are you?" I asked. She smiled the way an old photograph smiles, ranged and patient. "Agnes," she said. Her voice was old wool. "Nurse Agnes." I found the bench suddenly very solid. The staff room had small things, an iron good for pressing tablecloths, tins of lost buttons, late-night coffee rings. I told myself whatever I had seen was someone in old costume. I told myself too many things, but I wrote it down in a small notebook the way I had started it for other odd moments. Date, time, what I smelled camphor, what I heard lullaby, small details that keep you honest to yourself. That night I asked Carson, the maintenance guy, about an old nurse. He chewed the end of a broom handle and said, "You mean the sanatorium stories? This place used to be a medical lodge back when the town ran TB retreats. Folks say a nurse kept watch at the end of the ward." He shrugged. "You're the second person I've heard today who says they heard music." Ruth at the town archives liked me for my curiosity. She let me sift through boxes in a room that smelled like paper and lemon oil. There I found a brittle ledger, names written in a looping hand, notes in the margins. A line that read, "Nurse Agnes Lockwood, night shift, kept to her rounds. Complaints at administration door." The dates were 1931, 1933. There were patient lists, short sentences penciled like prayers, fever, restless, soothed at 2 a.m. A tiny newspaper clipping fell out between the pages. Administration investigates missing morphine at Hollow Sanatorium. The pattern in the ledger made my throat tighten. Agnes's notes read like a woman who had learned how to make a night less large. A dab of alcohol here, a folded blanket there, a patient soothed with a hand on her brow. The ledger suggested she'd been both meticulous and exhausted. Then a red ink scrawl by the director. "Conduct unbecoming. Relief will be arranged." I kept reading until the edges of the paper blurred. Somewhere in the ledger Agnes had written, "They whisper in the hallways. I give them sleep." I thought of the lullaby and the way she had asked about sleep as if it were a question of duty. The clipping about morphine said simply that vials were missing and that a number of patients had late, quiet deaths. The director's name had the taste of money beside it. Subplot 1, the piano. The piano in the lobby is a patient old thing with a lacquer job like a night sky. I started to sit with it after midnight, calling the lullaby I'd heard into the keys. The melody didn't belong to any sheet music I knew, but it clung when I found the right minor shift. I recorded the tune and took it to Luis. No, not Luis, Mateo, the bartender who read books like some people read weather. He listened with his chin on his fist and said, "That's not a hotel song. That's a ward song. Nurses humming in wings." He tapped his phone and found, tucked in a regional audio archive, a cracked cylinder recording of a woman's voice humming the very same line. Label, "Night Rounds, Hollow Sanatorium minus 1932. The voice was far and small, but the cadence matched Agnes's lullaby. Hearing it felt like lighting a candle in a room that had been dark for a long time. Subplot 2, the missing records. Ruth dug deeper. There were mentions of the director paying for discretion and an insurance payout when the sanatorium closed a year after the complaints. The more we found, the more the story bent toward simple ugliness, a profitable institution that lost money on prolonged care, a nurse who kept patients calm at the cost of a missing supply of sedatives, and a quietly furious administration who chose to close ranks rather than explain. There was a photograph of Agnes in a group shot, a woman with a quick jaw and gentle hands, and beside her an inscription in pencil, "Agnes, keep the night." Someone had scratched the words out. I started leaving small things by the bench, a folded note with her name, a clean handkerchief, a ribbon. The next morning things were moved just a touch. Once I found a tiny scrap of the linen tucked into the piano bench. Agnes's appearances changed when I started to speak her name aloud in the lobby. She came less like a question and more like a person with a request. One night she stepped through the double doors and moved along the wing where the old patient rooms had been converted to suites. I followed because I needed to know if hovering could become action. She paused at a door and pressed her hands to the wood like a woman checking for a pulse. "Did they sleep?" She breathed. They did, I said, though it felt like I was answering on behalf of people I'd never met. Yes, she whispered. Thank you. Still, she kept visiting. There's a difference between being thanked and being remembered well. I thought perhaps what she wanted was a record, a name written where the papers had not been allowed to keep the whole truth. The ending came not with spectacle, but with a small, human ritual. I arranged a reading in the lobby, nothing official. Only staff and a few older locals who remembered the sanatorium's name. Whispered in church basements. We brought the ledger, the brittle clipping, the cylinder recording. I read Agnes's name and read lines from her notes, kept her rounds, gave sleep, relief arranged. Ruth lit a candle and Matteo set the piano to the lullaby. People said names aloud, names of patients listed in that ledger, the director, Agnes, until the chandelier felt heavy with words. Agnes arrived as the final notes faded. She was standing at the piano now, hands folded like someone entering a quiet chapel. The hush in the room was not theater hush. It was the kind that happens when people reckon with what they've learned. For the first time, the nurse looked not at me, but at the circle of people who held the facts, and the names and the small human proofs. She allowed herself to smile like a brief sunrise across a mountain ridge. You remember, she said, and the voice was a breeze that smelled of starch and CAMPHO or dot. We had not cleared everything. There was no court case. We did not make a hero of her the way a headline might demand. We gave Agnes back her name and read the ledger out loud. I asked Ruth to take the scrap of the director's paid hush into the Historical Society, where at least the truth would be cataloged under something honest. Matteo recorded the lullaby again and offered a copy to the archive. After the reading, Agnes moved down the corridor as if following a scheduled round. She paused at the pantry door, reached as if to smooth a towel, and then, with a small, satisfied motion, she stepped through the kitchen wall like steam through a crack. Her presence thinned to the scent of camphor and a faint trailing note of the lullaby. I didn't see her again the way I had at first. Sometimes at night I would hear the piano, a single, patient bar in the dark, and I would think I sensed a steady step pacing in another room. Once, on the way home, I paused at the bridge that overlooks the river and hummed the lullaby until I felt steady. Agnes's voice, if it can be called that now, had gone from a question to a concluding sentence. I kept my little notebook for a long time. I put the ledger photocopy under glass at town hall the week Ruth arranged it. Folks nod when they walk by, the way people nod at graves they pass every Sunday. Small, regular acknowledgement. Guests ask sometimes about the hotel's hauntings, and I tell them the abbreviated version. There was a nurse. She tended the nights. She asked only to be named. People listen, half amused, half solemn, and move on. A year after the reading, I stopped working nights. I took a day job closer to my mother, whose hands had started to forget how to make tortillas without a list. Before I left, I pressed a folded note in the crook of the piano bench. It said, simply, Agnes Lockwood, kept the night. Thank you for the small, stubborn work, for the lullaby sometimes, late when the wind is thin and the river is an exact silver. I walk past the lobby and hear a single, careful chord. It isn't a summons. It is an exhale. The hotel holds its histories like a cabinet of plates. We dust the edges so the stories don't gather the sort of mold secrets growing. Remembering is how we let some things stop walking in circles. The end. I learned to read a building the way other people read faces. The little tales that tell you whether it's tired, mending, or pretending to be okay. My name is Rowan Vale. I was 28 and the night conservation tech at the Bitterroot boarding house. A hulky brick place that sat like a bad memory above the frozen rails of a Colorado mining town. The owners wanted it polished for tourists. I wanted the honest dirt left in the corners. I liked the hush of nights there, coffee cold on the counter, the slow tick of heaters, the way old plaster sighs when it settles. It felt like work that was also listening. They mentioned the widow in orientation with the same kind of humor people use. When they hand you a tool and tell you it's blunt. She likes to make rounds, old Marta the night manager said, not smiling. She checks the doors. She said it like a recipe note. I laughed. I told myself I believed it would creaks and the wind. The first time I saw her was because I had the radio to loud in a tea kettle. That wouldn't shut off. I was boxing up moth-eaten linens from a third-floor room when the corridor light shifted, and there she was at the end of the hall, a woman in a heavy black dress with a high collar, lace at the wrist, and a small oil lamp held like a compass. Her hair was braided tight and round with frost, though the heat vents hummed just below. The lamplight pulled at her feet like an animal's breath. I should have clattered the cart and warned myself I was being foolish. I did none of that. I simply watched. She moved slowly, methodical as someone on a schedule. She paused at each door, pressed her fingers to the wood, and whispered something that sounded like a name. When she reached vacant room 306, she stepped in, closed the door, and for a second the lamp's light painted the keyhole a lonely gold. Then the door swung open. She stepped out, and her face, when she inclined it toward me, was more cold than flesh, streaks of ash along her cheek, eyes that kept a strange steadiness but did not blink like the living do. Her mouth shaped words without making sound. "Who are you?" I asked because saying nothing felt like a wager I was to pour to win. She looked at me like someone reading a ledger. "Evelyn," she said. Her voice was somewhere between wind in a cold chute and old shawls rubbing together. "I keep them warm." I laughed once, the hybrid laugh of someone pretending to be braver than they felt. "The building keeps them cold, mostly," I said. I wanted to make light, and I wanted to leave that sentence in the air, like a rung you could climb down. Evelyn tilted her lamp toward my boots, and for a heartbeat I saw what she saw, a scuff. A line of old coal dust. "Your hands are steady," she murmured, and then she continued her rounds. The lullaby of her lamp moving down the hall. The rooms she tended were not ordinary rooms. They were the old miners' rooms on the third floor that the owners had left largely untouched. Wide windows with flaking paint, little iron radiators, a single chair and a shelf for boots. When I later opened room 306 to air it, the radiator was warm, though the building's steam was off, and the small stovepipe had a neat pile of coal that hadn't been there. When I locked the door hours earlier, I found a child's wooden shoe under the bed, scuffed and old. The ledger in the office told me nothing about a child. It had the miners' names, the rent ledgers, an org chart, and a margin note. No departures. Keep to work. I started keeping a notebook. The business of collecting details is how I anchor myself: time, smell, sound, temperature. I wrote that she hummed a lullaby that I could almost never remember after the moment passed. I wrote that the lamp never guttered though it left no soot. I wrote that she checked doors in a sequence that made sense only to her. The ledger entry I kept under glass in the lobby was a different kind of record. Slow handwriting by a woman named M. Thorne. Ray. Room assignment, 1896 leave for inheritor. There was no mention of Evelyn. Subplot 1. The miners' children. At the Historical Society, I learned the boarding house had once been a mix of miners and their families, a cramped ecosystem. In the winter of 1898, an elevator accident in the mine killed several men. 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, were recorded as missing, presumed swept. The official minutes used the language of insurance and closure. The town paper had a small notice about a woman named Evelyn Morse, widow, who kept the house and tended the children. Then it stopped. No obituaries, no follow-ups. Ruth at the archive shrugged and said, record keeping was for numbers then. People were less cared for. Her words sit in me like quick coal. Subplot 2. The lullaby and the lamp. Mateo, the bartender who had a second job as the town's reluctant folklorist, had a cousin whose granny remembered the melody. Mateo and I spent a January night with a cracked cylinder recording the granny, made at the fair decades ago. The melody matched the fragment I heard in the boarding house, but the words were a different town old lullaby about keeping the light through winter storms. Mateo said they sang that to little ones so they'd sleep through the rounds. The songs we keep are the parts of ourselves we owe to the dark. Evelyn began to grow more distinct the more I learned. Her rounds were less aimless than ritual. She'd pinch the wallpaper at certain rooms, straighten a picture frame no one had hung, and in the quiet hours set a small black ribbon on the nightstand of each bed. The ribbons were coin-sized knots, tied with a particular method I recognized from old morning manuals. Once I touched a ribbon and felt the faintest prickle like static. "Why do you do that?" I asked her one night when the wind made the panes sing. She looked toward the stairwell, and the lamp's light went through her like a thread through cloth. "They forget," she said simply, "and when the living forget the dead, the cold finds a space." Her language was direct. The boarding house was full of names that had been forgotten by the town in the tidy sense. Wives who'd taken in sewing, miners who left for Spokane and never sent a letter, children who disappeared into winter flights. I began to sit up late, making rubbings of door frames, cross-referencing ledgers with census papers. The list of those in the margins grew scarily long. One night, when wind threatened to take the eaves off the building, I found Evelyn in the boiler room spreading out small notes on the pipes. They were folded slips of paper, long saved and soot-stained. On them she had written, or someone had written and left for her hand names: Thomas K -198, Lena -598. She watched me with a wide, thin smile when I came down the metal stairs. "Do you know these names?" I asked, holding the slip like it might cut. She nodded. "I was given the keeping," she said, as if it were a job title. "They asked me to keep them warm." "How?" The steam hissed. The boiler made the kind of sound that sounds like apology. She touched the edge of the paper with fingers that were colder than the night. "By saying them," she said softly. "By speaking them when no one else would. That night I did something small and reckless. I gathered the slips and took them to Ruth. Together we organized them into a binder, gave each a transcription in neat block letters, and had the binder placed in the society with a notice, unclaimed, names. We printed a small page in the local column asking for relatives. The idea felt like feeding an old clock a coin. It might wake, or it might not. But at least we tried. After that, nights changed. Evelyn still made rounds, but she paused now at the lobby where the binder sat under glass. She looked at the people who came to the glass, an old widow with a memory too sharp for her knees, a man who'd owed his name a proper funeral, and let the lamp dim as if in permission. Once, when the old widow placed a worn mitten beside the binder, Evelyn reached, and for half a breath I thought I saw her fingers close the space between glove and skin. The widow smiled and said aloud, "Bless you." A thing you say when you feel the hand of a story finally touch you. The ending was a small domestic kindness, the kind of closure that looked like housekeeping. We arranged a quiet remembrance in the boarding house's front parlor. People came with little tokens, a rusted button, a sepia photograph, a crocheted square. Mateo tuned a battered harmonium and played the lullaby slowly. I read names from the binder until the chandeliers looked less veneered and more like pieces of a large, truthful room. When the last name was read, when the room held the list like a promise, Evelyn stood at the threshold. The lamp in her hand was steady and somehow softer. For the first time, her face looked like a woman who had been allowed a good thing. The seams of grief smoothed, the set of the jaw released. "You have given them a place," she said, her voice thin with something like relief. "They are warm." She set her lamp on the mantel, in plain sight, and for a moment its flame looked like a living thing and not a glare in a glass. Then she stepped forward, and instead of walking away, she walked up the center of the room like a woman checking a table is set. At the last step, she lifted her hand, and the lamp's light rose and rose until it filled the ceiling, and she, with the smallest, private smile, folded into that light. Like smoke through sun dot, we left the lamp on the mantel. Months later, guests would remark to the desk clerk that the boarding house had a different feeling, softer at the edges. The binder was cataloged in the Historical Society, and now when people ask where the house's oddities begin, they are told. Plainly, it was a place where people were kept in mind. I keep a photocopy of the ledger in my own pocket sometimes, the way one carries a small talisman. I still go by the boarding house on occasion and hum the lullaby at the bar, not because I think it is summoning anything, but because the song is an honest thing to hold. Do I think she was a ghost? I think she was a duty-made human. I think the night needs keepers the way a garden needs someone to pull the weeds. She does not haunt in malice, she keeps rounds. If you stay long enough on the third-floor landing when the steam is low and the winter is high, you might glimpse a lamp at the hall's end and hear a small voice count names into the quiet. It is not a summons, it is a keeping, the end. Source summary: a skeptic joins a 3-week winter expedition along a frozen northern river, where the group begins hearing a disembodied voice ordering someone to keep moving. Strange dragging tracks appear, and a ragged, frozen figure briefly manifests beside the camp. After surviving the trek, the narrator finds a mid-19th century journal entry that records the same shouted commands, proving the voice was tied to a long-dead fur trader. I remember signing the waiver with a hand that shook, and not from cold. I'd been a medic for 8 years, pulled more broken people from crashed cars and icy rivers than I wanted to count. And after the woman on County 17 didn't make it despite everything I did, I needed the kind of quiet that clinics and grief counselors couldn't give me. So when the ad for a 3-week winter traverse of the Upper Blue showed up in my feed, advertised by a grizzled outfitter named Luther Crow who'd run backcountry trips since before my dad learned to read maps, I booked it on a near impulse. I told myself this was the reset, wilderness, routine, the kind of honest fatigue that cuts away the noise. We left Breckenridge when the sky was a hard steel. the world already buried to the tops of the fence posts. There were 7 of us. Me, a 34-year-old former ambulance medic named Amani Cross, trying not to feel like a walking wound. Ava, a glaciologist from Denver hauling a weather station in a soft case. Nate and Josie, the siblings on a gap year adventure. Tom Reed, a freelance photographer with a camera permanently strapped to his chest. And a quiet older woman, Ruth, who said very little until she needed to say it. Luther ran the expedition, a blunt man with a laugh like a saw and a knowledge of every ridge and cutoff. He carried a compass that looked ancient and refused to let us use GPS unless there was an emergency. His voice was all facts and weather and directions. And when he told me the route would take us through a place locals called Hollow Bend, I should have listened harder. Our days were work, pack sleds, check lines, feed the dogs, churnily boil snow for water, make coffee that tasted like metal. The sky was a whitewash half the time, the other half an enormous dome of quiet. At night we clustered in canvas, breathing steam into our sleeping bags. I talked more on those nights than I had planned, to drown out the after images of the highway, to prove I could still make jokes, to anchor myself with human voices. I told them about ambulances and bad coffee and the way my fingers still jerked. With a reflex to pressure points, Ruth told us she'd been a nurse once and that she knew what it was to live with a thing. That kept coming back. Ava kept a small journal of snow depth and microfractures. She liked to say she was listening to the mountain, which I found almost poetic, until something about the way she listened made me uncomfortable. On the 9th night, while the rest slept, I heard it for the first time. It was beneath the wind, the kind of sound you feel in your bones before your ears even register it. A man's voice, low and urgent, repeating a command, not in English, not in any language I could place cleanly, but hard consonants and clipped vowels that felt like marching. It was close enough that I could have put my hand out the tent flap and touched the edge of it. I nudged Tom awake. "You hear that?" I whispered. Tom listened, and his face went still in the way that camera faces go still when the shutter reads a scene. "Sounds like somebody shouting," he mouthed back. His hands trembled slightly around the thermos. By morning we had strange lines in the snow beyond the ring of our camp. Tracks that were too narrow to be human boots and irregular to be deer. They looped like someone had dragged something, but the pattern was wrong. Half shoe, half sledge. Luther examined them with little interest, like an old man confronted by a new kind of weather. "Old logging sleds can make odd gouges," he muttered, but his jaw was tight. "There's stories up here. Men who move goods before roads. People think the river keeps memory." I didn't sleep that day. Over the next week the voice kept returning, sometimes like a far cry that bled across the hills, sometimes so close I could feel the hair on my neck lift. It had a cadence that sounded almost like direction, to syllables. A pause, then another, something like, "Keep, go, move." Once, late and raw and hungry, I poked my head out and saw no one, only the greenish flare of aurora spilling over the ridge. Tom swore he saw a man on the far bank, hunched in a ragged fur coat, but when he blinked the figure was gone. On day 12, Ava found a rusted tin on a shelf of packed snow where the river cut a small cliff. Inside was a brittle, folded sheet of paper wrapped in oilskin. She brought it to us with the reverence of a kid who'd unearthed treasure. The handwriting was cramped and purposed, the language old, a mix of English and French turns of phrase that felt like old trade routes and older grudges. The journal mentioned a man named Gervais who refused to leave his dogs behind, who barked orders while men wrapped him in canvas and lashed him to a sledge for the last slow ride to the fort. The final line said he shouted at the animals until he could not shout anymore. We read it aloud around the stove and the room went small. Ruth said, "Careful, people keep stories so they don't have to believe what they can't fix." I pushed that away with jokes and coffee and more chores. The second subplot crept in like frost under a boot. Eva started finding tiny fractures in the river ice. That didn't match the recorded pattern she expected. Lines of stress that seemed to bloom overnight. At first we thought it was seasonal variance, but then whole patches of the route changed, as if something under the ice rearranged itself while we slept. She argued for stopping, for testing the thickness, but Luther, stubborn as a winter mule, said the trail had been used and was still used. "Rivers change, kid," he said. "You can measure until your hands fall off. We keep moving." Movement was the point, the voice seemed to say. One night, around a small drift blown into a perfect crescent, the dogs went mad. They yelped and strained and refused to be calmed. A man's cry, not through a radio, Not a sound made by living lungs ripped the air. The command was so precise, so full of intent. It felt like someone trying to force a failing motor back to life. "Get up," Luther hissed. "Line up, now." We scrambled, hunks of sleeping bags and boots, hearts hammering. While we shone headlamps into the dark, the light played on a silhouette less than 10 feet away. A gaunt profile in a fur that was roped and crusted like an old taxidermy. There were no footprints where he'd stood. Tom screamed an animal sound, then covered his mouth, eyes wide like a kid who'd been shown a ghost at a sleepover. I felt my hands go cold and hot at once, my medic's brain failing to reconcile the theater with the facts. He was there. They all saw him, and then he wasn't. The air smelled like old leather and something else, an iodine tang that set my teeth on edge. Ava said later, if memory could congeal, maybe that's what it looked like. I wanted that explanation then like a warm coat. We pushed on. The river narrowed and the wind sharpened its teeth. The photographs Tom took began to misbehave, a smear where a face should be, a duplicate of an arm, a whole frame that developed with a dark line across it that hadn't been in the original exposure. My dreams started to stitch images I'd seen on the road, hands grasping a steering wheel, a patient's eyelids fluttering into the voice's pattern, and I woke more exhausted than I slept. At times I would catch myself mouthing the command under my breath, while inoculating a dog with a vitamin, a sliver of someone else's cadence, spilling over into my own. There was another scene, one I didn't expect, an argument. Nate accused Luther of endangering us for the sake of stubbornness. Ava accused Nate of not understanding the science. Ruth accused us all of being city people who come north to feel something we can't find in ourselves. I remember standing between them like some thin, brittle sheet, trying to keep the argument from falling into fists. The air was raw with hurt, but also with something softer, grief. We were all running from things, my failure, Ava's fear that the ice was failing her research, Ruth's quiet loss of a husband to a slipping creek years ago, and the river, or whatever hung over it, sounded like the push we'd all been avoiding. On the 21st day, we reached the ranger station at Slate Crossing, our endpoint. Men with park patches and government clipboards met us with thermoses and the kind of bureaucracy that felt pedestrian after weeks of raw landscape. I remember the first hot cup of cocoa like a confession. When I returned home and dug into the state archives on a bored, clumsy afternoon, I found a single ledger mention, a transport in winter of 1862, a list of goods, and one line scrawled in the margin by a clerk with bad eyes. Gervais spoke to his dogs. Mints where they heard him still as the slate carried him. There was no flourish, no delight in the story, only a clerical note as if to say the thing happened and paperwork had to accept it. Here's the twist that stayed with me and irritated every rational bone in my body. When I came back to town, I started waking at 2 in the morning and talking. I'd find myself pacing the kitchen, whispering cadence into the cold like a metronome. Sometimes I woke with my fingers ink-stained from a pen I didn't remember picking up. The old journal's language clumsy on my page as if someone else's hand were trying to finish a sentence. Once, during a long drive when the highway was a ribbon of black, I heard the voice on the radio, not from static, but threaded through some old country station like a ghost in the signal, saying the command in a cadence I could now pronounce in my sleep. Ava later told me she'd checked our photographs and found a strip of frames at the very center of our trip where exposure failed on purpose. A shadow, then blankness, then a tiny patch of preserved white where something like a face might be. She sent me a copy of those images in an email title for When You Don't Believe. I didn't open it for 3 days. I tried to explain it away. Stress, hypothermia, collective psychosis. I told myself that rivers kept echoes, that sound can refract in snow and ice. But that's the thing about truth. Sometimes it wears a coat you can't recognize. The voice didn't feel malevolent. It felt unfinished, like someone who'd been trying to get a party moving down a long, cruel road. In the months after, my sleep was a ledger of starts and stops. I hated the sound of my own breath, because sometimes in it I heard another syllable folded in. An old cadence the river had given me. I don't go back into high country in winter anymore. I run colder errands now, smaller ones. But I keep a tiny notebook where I scratch the phrases that come to me in the night. Sometimes I read them aloud in the car, just to see whether they feel mine. Once, at a gas station off the interstate, a man with a face like weather asked me if I had ever been out on Hollow Bend. When I told him yes, he nodded like he already knew and said, "Some people you meet stay on the road, even when they don't have legs left to walk." He smiled at that like it was a joke. There are nights, clear, brittle ones when snow cuts like glass, when my window fogs and I swear the house bends toward the sound of my old steps. In the clinic hallway, toward the echo of someone trying to push a team forward. I hear it and I stand very still, and sometimes I answer under my breath, because some last-worded men keep on telling the living how to travel, and some of us learn, in the end, to obey. The end.